Lonely rancher bought a child at auction, then discovered she was his own blood. Samuel Hayes thought he was saving a stranger's child at the auction block, but the auctioneer's final words about her dead mother would shatter everything he believed about his lonely past. The morning sun beat down on Millfield's town square like the judgment of an angry god. Samuel Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat, watching something that made his stomach turn to stone. The auction block, that cursed platform of shame where broken families came to be scattered like seeds in a bitter wind. He'd ridden into town for supplies, nothing more. Flour, salt, maybe some tobacco if his money stretched. The ranch had been quiet for too long, the silence pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shift. 3 years since Martha died, 3 years of talking to his horse, and eating beans cold from the can, because lighting the stove felt too much like hope. But now he stood frozen, watching as auctioneer Briggs called out lot numbers like he was selling livestock. Next item, Briggs announced, his voice carrying across the square with practiced indifference. One girl child, age approximately 8 years. Sold to settle the estate debts of one Elena Vasquez, deceased. The crowd stirred with the hungry interest of vultures. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as a small figure was led onto the platform. She couldn't have weighed more than a sack of grain, her dark hair hanging in tangles around a face that belonged on a church angel, not an auction block. Her dress, if the torn brown fabric could be called such, hung loose on her thin frame like a funeral shroud. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel's heart. Dark and deep as midnight water, they held no tears. No pleading, just a terrible, ancient acceptance that no child should ever have to carry. She's healthy stock, Briggs continued, his words turning Samuel's blood to ice. Can cook, clean, tend to livestock. Been working since she could walk. Starting bid is $5. Hands shot up across the crowd. Samuel recognized some of the bidders. Men whose wives had died in childbirth, widowers looking for unpaid help, ranchers who saw children as nothing more than extra hands for harvest time. His jaw clenched as he watched them bid on her, like she was a horse at market. $8, called out Jake Morrison, a man whose own children had learned to hide when he came home drunk. 10, shouted another voice. The girl's gaze swept across the crowd, taking in each face with the careful attention of a deer checking for predators. When her eyes met Samuel's, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the shared understanding of two souls who knew what it meant to be alone. Samuel's hand moved before his mind could stop it. $15, he heard himself say, his voice cutting through the desert air like a knife. The crowd turned to stare. Samuel Hayes, the hermit rancher who hadn't spoken to another soul in months, was bidding on child. He felt their curious eyes boring into him, but he couldn't look away from the girl. Something in her expression had shifted, not hope, exactly, but perhaps the faint possibility that the devil you didn't know might be kinder than the ones you did. 15 from Samuel Hayes, Briggs called out. Do I hear 16? Morrison's hand twitched upward, but his wife grabbed his wrist, shaking her head with the fierce determination of a woman who'd already raised too many children on too little money. One by one, the other bidders fell silent, unwilling to go higher for a girl who looked like she'd blow away in the next strong wind. Going once, Briggs announced. Going twice. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. What was he doing? He could barely take care of himself, let alone a child. His ranch was falling apart, his savings nearly gone, his future as uncertain as tomorrow's weather. But the girl's eyes held his across the crowd, and he saw something there that reminded him of who he used to be, before loss had carved the hope out of his chest. Sold to Samuel Hayes for $15. The gavel's crack echoed across the square like a gunshot. Samuel's legs carried him forward through the crowd, his hand already reaching for the worn leather pouch where he kept his money. $15, more than he'd spent on anything but seed and feed in 2 years. The coins felt heavy as lead in his palm as he counted them out for Briggs. She's yours now, Hayes, the auctioneer said, handing over a folded piece of paper. Papers are all in order. Girl goes by whatever name you give her. The mother never bothered with proper registration. Samuel took the document without reading it, his attention focused on the child who now belonged to him. She stood perfectly still beside the platform, waiting, not fidgeting or crying like a normal child might. Just waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that struggling only made things worse. He approached her slowly, like he might a spooked horse. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. She looked up at him with those midnight eyes, considering whether the truth was safe to share. "They call me different things," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama called me her little star, but that was before she died, before the debts came calling, before a child became something to be sold to the highest bidder." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of that single word. "Well," he said, extending his hand to her, "I think I'll call you Grace. Would that be all right?" She stared at his outstretched palm for a long moment, then placed her small hand in his. Her fingers were cold despite the desert heat, and Samuel felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a door he'd kept locked for too long. "Grace," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Yes, sir." "That would be all right." As they walked through the crowd towards Samuel's horse, Briggs called out behind them, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man used to dealing in human misery. "You got yourself a bargain there, Hayes. That girl's got good bloodlines. Her mama was Elena Vasquez. Pretty little Mexican gal, worked the cantinas before she got herself in trouble. Shame what happened to her, really. Heard she used to sing like an angel before the consumption took her. Elena Vasquez." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow, stopping him dead in the middle of the square. The world tilted sideways, the sun suddenly too bright, the air too thin. Grace's hand tightened in his as he swayed slightly, his face gone pale as winter snow. "Elena." Sweet, beautiful Elena with her voice like honey and her laugh that could chase away any shadow. Elena, who he'd loved with the desperate passion of a young man who thought love could conquer anything. Elena, who he'd abandoned 20 years ago when the town's disapproval became too much to bear, when the pressure of being a white man loving a Mexican woman in a world that saw such love as sin had finally broken his resolve. Elena, who apparently had died alone, leaving behind a daughter who... Samuel's eyes dropped to the child beside him, taking in her features with new understanding. The dark hair, yes, but now he noticed the shape of her nose, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head when she was thinking. His features, reflected back at him in a face that belonged to the woman he'd never stopped loving and the child he'd never known existed. The papers in his hand suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear Briggs still talking, probably moving on to the next lot, but the words faded into meaningless noise. All Samuel could hear was the sound of his own breathing, too fast and too shallow, and the whisper of wind across the desert that seemed to carry Elena's voice, singing the lullabies she used to hum when she thought no one was listening. Grace looked up at him with concern, her small face creased with worry. "Mr. Samuel? Are you feeling poorly?" He forced himself to breathe, to stand upright, to keep walking toward his horse. The truth sat in his throat like a stone, too big to swallow, too sharp to speak. This child, his child, looked at him with the polite distance of a stranger, having no idea that the man who just bought her freedom was the same one whose cowardice had sentenced her to this life in the first place. "I'm fine," he managed to say, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just the heat. We'll be home soon." As he lifted Grace onto his horse and swung up behind her, Samuel Hayes carried the weight of a truth that would change everything. In trying to save a stranger's child, he'd unknowingly purchased his own daughter, a daughter who bore the name of the woman he'd loved and lost, and who would now have to live with the consequences of choices made long before she was born. The ride home stretched out before them, filled with silence and questions that had no easy answers. But for now, It was enough to feel the small weight of grace pressed against his chest, to know that whatever sins lay buried in his past, he'd been given one last chance to do right by the people he'd failed. The dust of Millfield settled behind them as they rode into an uncertain future, carrying secrets that would soon demand to be told. Grace moved through Samuel's empty ranch like a ghost who knew she didn't belong. But when she hummed a lullaby he hadn't heard in 20 years, the past came crawling out of the desert dust. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across the valley like the skeleton of some great beast, bleached white by years of unforgiving sun. Samuel's grandfather had built the main house from adobe and dreams, back when the land still held promise and the creek ran year-round. Now the paint peeled from the shutters like old skin, and half the fence posts leaned at angles that spoke of surrender. Samuel dismounted first, then reached up to help Grace down from the horse. She slid into his hands light as a sparrow, her small boots hitting the dusty ground without a sound. For a moment they stood there in the afternoon heat, the child taking in her new world with those careful, measuring eyes. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said quietly, and Samuel felt something twist in his chest at the wonder hidden beneath her cautious words. "Used to be bigger," he replied, leading the horse toward the barn. "Back when my Martha was alive, we ran cattle clear to the far ridge. Now it's just me and a few chickens too stubborn to die." Grace followed at a safe distance, her gaze moving from the sagging barn roof to the well with its broken handle, cataloging everything with the sharp attention of a child who'd learned that understanding your surroundings might be the difference between safety and sorrow. The house smelled of dust and disuse when Samuel pushed open the front door. He watched Grace step across the threshold, her small frame dwarfed by the rooms that had once echoed with Martha's laughter and the promise of children who never came. The furniture sat under white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and the windows were so thick with grime they turned the sunlight brown. "You hungry?" Samuel asked, because it seemed like the kind of thing a person should ask a child, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd fed anyone but himself. Grace shook her head, but her stomach chose that moment to growl loud enough to wake the dead. Samuel almost smiled, the first time his face had made that motion in months. "Well, I am," he lied gently. "Help me see what we can find." The kitchen told the story of a man who'd forgotten how to live instead of just survive. A can of beans sat open on the counter from that morning's breakfast, and the only clean dish was a single tin cup. Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks as he saw his world through Grace's eyes, the emptiness of it, the loneliness thick as dust on every surface. He found some hardtack and a bit of jerky that wasn't too tough, arranged it on the cleanest plate he could find. Grace ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned never to waste food, chewing slowly and thoroughly, making each bite last. "Where will I sleep?" she asked when the meal was finished, her voice small in the big kitchen. Samuel's throat tightened. He'd been so focused on getting through the auction, on the shock of Elena's name echoing in his ears, that he hadn't thought past bringing the child home. The house had 3 bedrooms, his own, the one that had been meant for the children he and Martha never had, and a small room at the back that they'd used for storage. "There's a room," he said finally. "Needs cleaning, but it's got a window that catches the morning light." He led her down the narrow hallway, past the closed door of Martha's sewing room, to the small chamber at the house's end. Boxes and forgotten furniture crowded the space, but beneath the clutter was a narrow bed and a dresser with a cracked mirror. "I'll get this cleared out for you," Samuel promised, already moving boxes aside. "Make it proper." Grace stood in the doorway, not entering, not running, just watching him work with that careful attention she gave everything. When he pulled a moth-eaten quilt from one of the boxes, she made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but close. "That's pretty," she said softly, reaching out to touch the faded fabric. "Mama had one like it, blue and yellow, like morning glories." Samuel's hands stilled on the quilt. "Your mama, she made things?" "Quilts and such. She made lots of things." Grace's voice carried the careful tone of a child sharing something precious. "She could sew anything, dresses, curtains, little dolls from scraps. And she sang while she worked. Always singing. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. Elena had always been working with her hands, always humming under her breath. He could see her still in his mind's eye, bent over some bit of needlework, her dark hair catching the lamplight as she sang soft Spanish lullabies that had made him feel like he was home for the first time in his life. What did she sing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace tilted her head, considering whether this memory was safe to share. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she began to hum. The melody was sweet and haunting, rising and falling like wind through wheat, and Samuel's knees nearly buckled as recognition flooded through him. Duérmete mi niña, duérmete mi amor. Elena's lullaby. The one she'd hummed when they lay together under the stars, when the world was young and love felt strong enough to overcome anything. He'd asked her once what the words meant, and she'd smiled and said it was a mother's song to her sleeping child, a promise that love would keep the darkness away. She sang that one a lot, Grace continued, unaware that she'd just torn open a wound Samuel thought had scarred over. Especially when the storms came. I don't like thunder much. Thunder. Elena had been terrified of thunderstorms, would curl up against Samuel's chest and shake like a leaf until the sky went quiet again. He'd held her through so many wild desert storms, promising her that nothing would hurt her while he was there. Another lie. Another promise he'd failed to keep. Well, he managed, his voice thick with unshed grief. If storms come, you just holler. This old house has weathered plenty of them. Grace nodded solemnly, then surprised him by stepping fully into the room for the first time. She moved to the small window and peered out at the endless expanse of scrubland and sky. It's quiet here, she observed. Different kind of quiet than town. Bigger, somehow. Samuel joined her at the window, careful to keep enough distance that she wouldn't feel crowded. Desert quiet, he said. Takes some getting used to. But once you do, other places feel too loud. Mama liked quiet too, Grace said. And then, as if the words had slipped out without permission, she pressed her lips together and stepped back from the window. They worked together for the next hour, clearing the room in companionable silence. Grace sorted through boxes with careful hands, setting aside things that might be useful and folding away others. Samuel found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, noting the way she moved with Elena's grace, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, a gesture he remembered from 20 years of regret. When she reached up to dust the top shelf of the dresser, her sleeve pulled back, and Samuel caught sight of something that made his breath catch. There, on the inside of her narrow wrist, was a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Dark against her skin, distinctive as a brand. Elena had carried the same mark in the same place. She'd been embarrassed by it, called it her Luna Pequeña, little moon, and tried to hide it beneath long sleeves and bracelets. But Samuel had loved it, had traced its shape with his finger, and told her it meant she belonged to the night sky, to mystery and magic. The room suddenly felt too small, too close. Samuel stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The humming, the fear of storms, the birthmark, each piece of evidence built on the last, creating a picture too clear to deny, but too terrible to accept. This child, this Grace who moved through his house like she was afraid to leave footprints, who rationed her trust like it was gold and ate her food like tomorrow might not come. This was Elena's daughter. His daughter, the child he'd never known existed, selling pieces of her mother's memory to a stranger who was anything but. Mr. Samuel? Grace's voice cut through his spiral of realization. You look pale. Maybe you should sit down. He was pale and shaking and probably looking like he'd seen a ghost, which in a way he had. Elena lived on in this child's face, in her gestures, in the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. 20 years of regret and longing had just walked through his door wearing a too big dress and eyes that held too much sorrow for their years. I'm fine, he lied, the same lie he'd been telling himself for 3 years. Just tired. It's been a long day. Grace nodded with the understanding of someone who knew that sometimes people needed space to hurt in private. "Should I stay in here tonight? The room's not finished yet." "No," Samuel said quickly, then softened his tone when he saw her flinch. "I mean, there's no hurry. You can sleep on the couch in the front room until we get this proper. Might be more comfortable anyway." She accepted this with a small nod, gathering up the few possessions she'd had with her. A worn hair ribbon and a wooden doll missing one arm. Samuel watched her cradle the doll like it was made of precious metal and felt another piece of his heart crack away. That night, as Grace settled onto the old sofa with a blanket Martha had crocheted years before, Samuel sat on his porch and stared up at the stars. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in its whisper he could almost hear Elena's voice, asking him the question he'd been asking himself for 20 years. "Why did you leave me?" Now he knew the answer carried even more weight than he'd thought. He hadn't just abandoned the woman he loved. He'd abandoned his own child, left her to grow up poor and motherless, and ultimately sold like livestock to pay debts he might have helped prevent. The guilt sat in his stomach like a stone, but beneath it stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring Elena back or erase the suffering his cowardice had caused. But Grace was here now, in his house, carrying her mother's songs and her father's stubborn jaw. Maybe it wasn't too late to do right by at least one person he'd failed. Inside the house, he could hear Grace moving restlessly on the couch, and when the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the desert, he heard her breath catch in fear. Samuel closed his eyes and listened to the storm approach, carrying with it the promise of rain and the echo of old lullabies, while in his living room, his daughter fought sleep and nightmares alone. The truth sat between them like a loaded gun, dangerous and patient, waiting for the moment when secrets became too heavy to carry and blood called to blood across the years of silence and regret. When the storm trapped them together in the ranch house, Grace whispered a single name in her terror. "Mama, Elena," and Samuel's world shattered as 20 years of buried guilt came crashing down like lightning. The storm came like vengeance across the desert, rolling in from the west with clouds black as charcoal and pregnant with rain the land desperately needed. Samuel felt it in his bones hours before the first drops fell, that electric tension that made horses skittish and set his teeth on edge. He'd been working in the barn, mending tack and trying not to think about the way Grace hummed Elena's lullaby while she swept the front porch. 3 days had passed since he'd brought her home. 3 days of careful politeness and unspoken questions that hung between them like smoke. She helped with chores without being asked, cooked simple meals with the efficiency of someone who'd been caring for herself too long, and spoke only when spoken to. But Samuel had been watching, cataloging each gesture and expression, building a case he didn't want to win. The way she pressed her hand to her stomach when nervous, exactly as Elena used to do. How she saved the best bits of food for last, savoring them like communion wine. The careful way she folded her few belongings each night, as if making herself small enough might protect her from disappointment. Each similarity was another nail in the coffin of his denial. The first crack of thunder sent the barn cats scurrying for cover and made Samuel's old horse, Buck, snort and paw the ground. Samuel glanced toward the house, worry gnawing at his gut. If Grace was like her mother, the storm would terrify her. As if summoned by his thoughts, lightning split the sky with white fire, and the thunder that followed shook the barn rafters. Through the growing darkness, Samuel could see Grace standing on the porch, her small figure silhouetted against the house's warm windows. Even at this distance, he could tell she was afraid, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the porch railing like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone, and Samuel abandoned his work to jog across the yard. The first fat drops were already falling, pattering against the dust like scattered coins. "Grace," he called over the rising wind. "Better get inside." She didn't seem to hear him, frozen in place as another bolt of lightning turned the world electric blue. Samuel took the porch steps 2 at a time and gently touched her shoulder. She whirled around, her eyes wide with terror, and for a moment Samuel saw Elena so clearly in her face that his breath caught. Same expression, same desperate need for comfort that pride wouldn't let her ask for. "Come on," he said softly, guiding her toward the door. "Let's get you inside where it's safe." The house felt different with the storm outside, smaller, more intimate. Samuel lit the oil lamps while rain began to hammer the roof in earnest, and Grace stood in the middle of the front room like a small ship adrift in an uncertain sea. "It's just weather," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "Old house like this has weathered hundreds of storms. We'll be fine." Grace nodded, but her knuckles were white where she clutched her wounded doll. Another flash of lightning illuminated the windows, and the thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations. That's when she broke. "Mama, Elena," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like a prayer. "Mama, Elena, make it stop." Samuel's world tilted sideways. The room spun around him, the lamplight blurring into golden smears as 20 years of questions found their terrible answer. Elena, his Elena, spoken like a sacred name by the child who shared his eyes and carried his stubborn chin. "What did you say?" The words came out hoarse, barely audible over the storm's fury. Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and in that moment she looked so much like Elena it was like seeing a ghost. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, misreading his shock for anger. "I know she's gone. I know she can't help anymore. But when the thunder comes, I always called for her, and she would sing to me until it passed." Samuel sank into Martha's old rocking chair before his legs gave out entirely. Elena. Elena Vasquez. The Mexican seamstress with a voice like honey and hands that could create beauty from scraps. The woman he'd loved with the desperate passion of youth and abandoned when the world proved bigger than his courage. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about Elena." Grace's eyes searched his face, perhaps seeing something there she didn't understand. Lightning flashed again, and she flinched, but the need to talk about her mother seemed stronger than her fear. "She was beautiful," Grace said, settling onto the floor near his chair but not too close. "Everyone said so." She had long black hair that smelled like the flowers she dried and put in sachets, and her voice, when she sang, even the drunk men in the cantina would get quiet and listen. The cantina. Samuel closed his eyes, remembering. That's where he'd first seen Elena, serving drinks and dodging grabbing hands with grace and dignity that shouldn't have been possible in such a place. He'd been young then, barely 25, working cattle drives, and thinking he was tough enough to handle anything the world threw at him. "She sang to you?" he asked, needing to know more, needing to understand the life he'd missed. "Every night," Grace said, her voice growing softer as another rumble of thunder rolled overhead. "She would brush my hair and sing 'Do her meet me, Nina,' until I fell asleep." She said her mama sang it to her, and her mama's mama before that. Said it was a song that carried love through the generations. Samuel's throat closed up entirely. He'd heard Elena sing that lullaby 1,000 times during their stolen months together, but he'd never imagined her singing it to their child. Their child, who had grown up poor and motherless while he worked his ranch and mourned his cowardice. How did she die? The question fell from his lips before he could stop it, and Grace's face crumpled with fresh grief. "The coughing sickness," she said, "started last winter and just got worse. She couldn't work much toward the end, and the medicine cost too much. She kept saying someone would come, that there was a man who would help us if she could just find him, but she kept saying someone would come." Samuel's heart shattered completely as the implication hit him. Elena had been looking for him, hoping he would somehow appear to save them. She died believing he might still care enough to help, never knowing that he drove through Millfield twice a year buying supplies and never once thought to ask about the woman whose absence had carved out his chest. "Grace," he said, his voice breaking on her name. "Look at me." She raised her tear-streaked face, and Samuel saw himself reflected back, The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way his eyebrows drew together when he was thinking hard about something difficult. "Your mama," he said carefully, each word feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. Did she ever tell you about your father?" Grace's expression grew wary, the careful guardedness of a child who'd learned that some questions led to pain. "She said he was a good man who got scared. Said sometimes good people make bad choices when the world gets too heavy, but that didn't mean they didn't love us. Even dying, Elena had been protecting him, making excuses for the man who'd abandoned her to face pregnancy and poverty alone." Samuel wanted to vomit. He wanted to put his fist through the wall. He wanted to scream at the sky and demand to know how God could let such goodness suffer while cowards like him lived comfortable lives. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair and looked into his daughter's eyes. "Grace," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Your mama's name was Elena Vasquez. She worked at the Silver Dollar Cantina. She had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her wrist, and she was afraid of thunderstorms." Grace stared at him, her mouth falling open slightly. "How do you?" "She loved morning glories and could sew anything from memory," Samuel continued. "She hummed while she worked and saved the last bite of everything sweet because she said dessert should end with the best part." "Stop," Grace whispered, but Samuel couldn't stop, not now that the truth was finally bleeding out of him. 20 years ago, I loved a woman named Elena Vasquez. Loved her with everything I had, but I was young and stupid and scared of what people would say about a white rancher taking up with a Mexican seamstress. So, when the pressure got too heavy, when the whispers got too loud, I ran. I left her and never looked back, never checked to see if she was all right, never knew that she was carrying my child." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Lightning flashed again, illuminating both their faces in stark detail, and Grace could no longer deny what had been written in their features all along. "You're him," she said, her voice barely audible. "You're the good man who got scared." Samuel nodded, tears he hadn't shed in years finally breaking free. "I'm your father, Grace. The coward who abandoned you both. The man who let fear make him into something he never wanted to be." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm's fury and Samuel's ragged breathing. Grace stared at him with those dark eyes that were so like Elena's, but held a hardness Elena had never needed to develop. "Mama died calling for you," she said finally, her voice flat with a terrible adult understanding. "She died broke and alone, coughing up blood in a room that cost more than we could afford, and her last words were asking me to find Samuel Hayes and tell him she never stopped loving him." Each word was a knife between Samuel's ribs, and he took them all without flinching. He deserved worse. He deserved to be horsewhipped and run out of town and made to feel every moment of Elena's suffering in his own flesh. "I know," he said simply. "I know I failed her. Failed you both. She sold everything," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength from anger that had been building for 8 years. "Her sewing machine, her mother's jewelry, even her hair to the wig maker. All to pay for medicine that didn't work and rent on a room where she died thinking you might still care enough to come." Samuel absorbed it all, the poverty, the desperation, the faith Elena had maintained even as consumption ate her alive. His beautiful, trusting Elena, who had excused his abandonment as fear instead of the cruelty it truly was. And then the debt collectors came, Grace said, standing up from the floor, her small frame trembling with fury. "They took everything that was left and put me on the auction block like a piece of livestock. Because my father was too much of a coward to face what he'd done." Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the house, but Grace didn't flinch this time. Her fear had been burned away by righteous anger, and Samuel found himself proud of her strength even as it flayed him alive. "You bought me," she said, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "You bought your own daughter because you were too guilty to let some stranger take me home. But you didn't save me, Mr. Hayes." You just bought yourself a chance to feel better about being the kind of man who walks away when love gets difficult. The truth of it hit Samuel like a physical blow. She was right. Every word was right, and the righteousness of her anger was more than he could bear. Yes, he said simply, that's exactly what I did. Grace stared at him, perhaps surprised by his honesty. The fight seemed to go out of her all at once, leaving behind a tired child and a woman's sorrows. Why? She asked, and the single word contained 20 years of abandonment and loss. Why did you leave us? Samuel looked out the window at the storm, watching lightning split the sky while he tried to find words adequate to explain the inexcusable. Because I was 25 and thought love was enough, he said finally. Because I didn't understand that the world would punish Elena for choosing me, and when I realized it would, I chose my own comfort over her happiness. Because I was weak and selfish and convinced myself that walking away was somehow protecting her. It wasn't, Grace said flatly. No, it wasn't. They sat in the charged silence while the storm raged outside, father and daughter finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. The truth lay between them like broken glass, beautiful and terrible and impossible to ignore. When Grace finally spoke again, her voice was small and tired and older than her years. What happens now? Samuel looked at this child who carried Elena's grace and his own stubborn streak, who had survived poverty and loss and the auction block with her spirit intact, and felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that and wouldn't ask for it. But perhaps something like purpose. Now, he said, I try to be the father I should have been from the beginning. If you'll let me. Grace considered this, her head tilted in that thoughtful way that was pure Elena. Outside, the thunder was growing more distant, the storm beginning to move on toward the eastern mountains. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said honestly. I don't know if I want to. I don't expect you to, Samuel replied. I don't forgive myself. She nodded, accepting this. Then, surprising them both, she moved closer to his chair. Tell me about the good parts. And as the storm rolled away across the desert, leaving the air clean and charged with possibility, Samuel began to speak. He told his daughter about Elena's laugh and the way she danced when she thought no one was watching. He told her about stolen afternoons and promises they'd been too young to keep. He spoke of love and loss and the terrible weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Grace listened with her mother's patience and her father's intensity. And when he finally ran out of words, the house felt different somehow, still broken, still haunted by years of silence, but no longer quite so empty. The truth was out now, devastating and undeniable as desert lightning. What they would build from the wreckage remained to be seen, but for the first time in 20 years, Samuel Hayes had hoped that it might be something worth having. Samuel didn't ask for Grace's forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. But through quiet acts of love and the patient tending of trust in hardened ground, a broken father and wounded daughter learned that sometimes redemption grows not from grand gestures, but from seeds planted in dust and silence. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, the desert air scrubbed clean by wind and rain. Samuel woke before sunrise as he had every day for 30 years, but for the first time and longer than he could remember, he had a reason to rise that went beyond mere habit. Grace was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with her broken doll in her lap, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. She didn't acknowledge his presence when he joined her, but she didn't move away either, a small mercy he hadn't dared hope for. Sleep all right? He asked, though the shadows under her eyes told him the answer. Some, she said, her voice neutral as still water. The thunder stopped. They sat in silence as the desert came alive around them. A roadrunner darted between the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The mundane magic of morning, Samuel thought, going on as it always had despite the upheaval of human hearts. Grace, he said finally, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to call me father or pretend that buying you at auction somehow makes up for 20 years of failure. I'm just asking for the chance to do right by you now, for whatever time we have. She turned to look at him then, those dark eyes studying his face with Elena's careful attention to truth. What does that mean? Doing right? Samuel had thought about little else through the sleepless hours of the night. It means teaching you to read and write properly, if you want to learn. It means making sure you have clothes that fit and food that fills you and a place that's yours for as long as you need it. It means telling you about your mama, so you know where you come from, the good parts and the hard parts both. Grace considered this, absently smoothing her doll's tangled yarn hair. And if I decide I want to leave? When I'm old enough? The question hit him like a fist to the chest, but Samuel kept his voice steady. Then I'll give you money and supplies and my blessing, and I'll know that at least I helped you get ready for whatever life you choose. She nodded slowly, accepting the terms of their unspoken contract. No promises of love or family, just practical care and the space to heal at her own pace. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and Samuel sensed that honesty was something Grace valued above comfort. I can read some, she said after a moment. Mama taught me letters and numbers. But not good enough for books. We'll work on that, Samuel promised. Martha left behind a whole shelf of books, just gathering dust. The mention of his dead wife created a brief awkwardness between them. Grace had been sleeping in Martha's front room, eating off Martha's dishes, existing in the ghost of another woman's life. But she surprised him by asking, what was she like? Your Martha? Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. Kind. Patient as summer rain. She would have loved having you here, always wanted children of our own, but the Lord had other plans. She used to say this house was too big for just two people, too quiet. Guess she was right. Did you love her the way you loved Mama Elena? The question was direct as a blade, but Samuel recognized it for what it was, a test of his honesty, a way to measure whether he could be trusted with truth. Different, he said carefully. I loved Martha like calm water, steady and peaceful. Your mama was like lightning, bright and dangerous and impossible to forget. Both kinds of love are real, Grace. Both kinds matter. She seemed satisfied with this answer, or at least willing to accept it. They spent the rest of the morning in careful domestic routine. Samuel making breakfast while Grace swept the porch, both of them learning the rhythm of sharing space without demanding intimacy. The days that followed fell into a pattern as regular as sunrise. Samuel would rise early to tend the animals and check the fence lines, while Grace maintained the house with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing a household since she could barely reach the stove. Afternoons were for lessons, Samuel dusting off Martha's primer and teaching Grace to sound out longer words, watching her dark head bend over the pages with fierce concentration. She was hungry for learning the way she'd been hungry for food, absorbing every scrap of knowledge like it was salvation. Within a week, she was reading simple stories aloud, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. Samuel found himself looking forward to these sessions, to the way her face lit up when she conquered a difficult word, to the questions she asked that showed a mind sharp as winter wind. Why did they sell me? She asked one afternoon as they worked through a story about a family traveling west. If children are supposed to be precious, why did they put me on the auction block like cattle? Samuel set down his coffee cup, choosing his words carefully. Because some people see children as property instead of people. Because the law says debts have to be paid, even if it means breaking up families. Because the world isn't always just, and sometimes good people get caught in the machinery of others. But you bought me, Grace said, not accusingly, but as if trying to understand puzzle. You could have let someone else do it. Yes, I could have. Samuel met her eyes, offering the truth she deserved. But when I saw you on that platform, you reminded me of someone I used to be. Someone who might have been brave enough to do the right thing, if he'd been given another chance. Grace processed this silently, then surprised him by reaching across the table to touch his weathered hand. Just briefly, just enough to acknowledge something passing between them. I'm glad it was you, she said quietly. Even knowing what I know now, I'm glad it was you who bought me." The admission was small and fragile as a bird's egg, but Samuel treasured it like gold. As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship grew stronger in small increments. Grace began helping with more complex chores, learning to milk the cow and gather eggs and mend fence posts. Samuel taught her to ride Buck, the old horse, accepting her slight weight with gentle patience. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Samuel shared stories of Elena, not just the romance, but the woman herself. Her stubborn streak and quick wit, her talent for making something from nothing, her fierce loyalty to the people she loved. "She sounds like you," Grace said one night as Samuel finished a story about Elena talking her way out of trouble with the sheriff after defending a drunk cowboy from a bully twice his size. "You think so?" Grace nodded. "The stubborn part, anyway. And the way you both try to fix things for people." It was the first time she'd compared him to her mother, as if it were a good thing, and Samuel felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Winter brought its own challenges and small victories. Grace caught a fever in December that lasted 3 days, and Samuel barely left her bedside, forcing soup down her throat and singing Elena's lullabies in his rusty baritone until the fever broke. When she was well again, she allowed him to brush her hair the way Elena used to, sitting still and patient while he worked out the tangles with gentle hands. "I remember now," she said one evening as he braided her hair for bed. "In town, sometimes I would see a man on a horse watching from across the street. Tall like you with sad eyes. Mama would get very quiet when she saw him, but she never said who he was." Samuel's hands stilled in her hair. "That was me. I rode through Millfield twice a year buying supplies. I saw you sometimes playing in the dust behind the cantina. I told myself it wasn't my business, that Elena had probably married someone else, but you knew," Grace finished for him. "Somewhere inside, you knew I was yours." "Yes," Samuel admitted. "I knew, and I was too much of a coward to find out for sure." Grace leaned back against his chest, a gesture of trust that nearly undid him. "Why now? Why buy me now when you wouldn't help us then?" Samuel finished her braid and tied it with a ribbon Martha had left behind. "Because seeing you on that auction block, I finally understood that some things are more important than fear. That some chances don't come around twice, and if you waste them, you live with the regret forever. And you don't want more regret." "I've got enough regret to last 10 lifetimes," Samuel said softly. "But I'd rather try and fail than wonder what might have been if I'd been brave enough to love you both the way you deserved." Grace turned in his arms to look at him, this child who carried her mother's beauty and her father's stubborn hope. "I think," she said slowly, "I think maybe Mama was right about you being a good man who got scared. Because a bad man wouldn't have bought me. A bad man wouldn't sit by my bed when I was sick or teach me to read or tell me stories that make me proud of where I come from." "Grace, I'm not ready to call you father," she said quickly, cutting off whatever desperate gratitude he'd been about to spill. "And I can't promise I'll ever forgive what happened to Mama. But I can promise that I'll try to see the man you're becoming instead of just the man you were." It was more than he deserved, more than he dared hope. Samuel pulled his daughter close and held her while the winter wind howled around the house, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of spring still months away. The seasons turned as they always had, but the Hayes Ranch no longer felt like a monument to loss. Grace grew taller and stronger, her laughter beginning to fill spaces that had been silent too long. She learned to cook Martha's recipes and tend Elena's memory with equal care, creating something new from the pieces of women who had loved Samuel in different ways. By the time her 9th birthday arrived, she was reading chapter books and helping Samuel plan the spring planting. They celebrated with a cake made from Martha's recipe and stories about Elena's birthdays, creating new traditions from old grief. "I've been thinking," Grace said as she blew out her candles, "about names." Samuel's heart jumped. "Oh, I like Grace," she said quickly. "It's a good name, and it's mine now. But I was thinking maybe sometimes when it's just us, I could call you Papa. Not Father, that feels too big still. But Papa, if that's all right." Samuel's vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide. "That would be more than all right, Grace. That would be everything." She smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her, and Samuel understood that redemption wasn't a single moment of forgiveness, but a choice made again and again, day after day, to plant seeds of love in ground that had been hardened by loss. As they sat together in the lamplight, father and daughter bound by blood and loss and the slow, patient work of healing, Samuel felt Elena's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. Not forgiving, perhaps, but approving of what they'd built from the ashes of his failures. The desert wind sang through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain and the possibility that even broken things could be made whole again, given enough time and tenderness and the courage to keep trying. Grace fell asleep that night with her head on Samuel's shoulder, and for the first time in 20 years, the Hayes Ranch felt like home.